Disclaimer.
As investigators search for clues that can help them find a missing mother feared dead, her husband sits in jail in connection with her disappearance.
Andre McDonald charged with tampering with evidence, but as our Devin Clark explains, local law experts say there's a chance he could be charged with murder even if Andreen's body is never found.
On the morning of March 1st, 2019, employees at a thriving San Antonio business began making frantic phone calls. Their boss, a 29-year-old businesswoman named Andreen McDonald, had not shown up for work, and for a woman known throughout her company for military-like punctuality, that alone was alarming. When coworkers called her Jim, hoping to catch her mid-workout, they learned she had not shown up there either. Breaking a routine she followed with almost religious discipline, investigators arriving at her home found something even stranger: her purse sitting untouched, her keys resting on the counter, her vehicles parked exactly where she always left them. Everything a woman would need for an ordinary day, still sitting inside a house she was nowhere to be found in. This is the story of a millionaire businesswoman who seemingly vanished into thin air, and the disturbing, methodical investigation that would ultimately expose exactly what happened to her, inside her own home, at the hands of someone she trusted completely. Before we continue, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss one of these stories. Now let's step inside that house. Andreen Nicole McDonald's story began far from the affluent suburbs of San Antonio. She was born on September 23, 1989, in Port Antonio, Jamaica, one of two daughters born to Hyacinth Farron and Paul Anderson. From an early age, those who knew her described someone driven, disciplined, and determined to build a life defined by hard work rather than circumstance. That determination would eventually carry her across an ocean, into a whirlwind romance, and ultimately into one of the most disturbing true crime cases Texas has seen in years. Family members who spoke publicly after her death consistently returned to the same word when describing her: unstoppable. A young woman who had grown up watching her mother work tirelessly, and who carried that same relentless work ethic with her into every chapter of her adult life. She met Andre McDonald, and the two fell into a fast-moving relationship, marrying and relocating to the United States, where Andre pursued a career as a cyber warfare analyst stationed at Lackland Air Force Base, eventually rising to the rank of major. Together, the couple settled in San Antonio and welcomed a daughter into their family. On the surface, this looked like a modern American success story: a driven immigrant entrepreneur, a decorated military officer, a beautiful child, and a rapidly growing family business. That business became the true engine of the McDonald family's success. While Andre continued his military career, Andreen built and grew an assisted living company from the ground up. Through sheer determination and business savvy, she transformed it into a multi-million-dollar operation, the kind of success story that would have made anyone proud. The money that flowed from that business funded an undeniably lavish lifestyle: a sprawling home in one of San Antonio's more affluent northern neighborhoods, high-end vehicles, and the outward appearance of a truly thriving American power couple. Colleagues who worked alongside her described a woman who insisted on hands-on involvement in every aspect of the business. Someone who had earned every dollar of that success through long hours and careful, deliberate decision-making, rather than luck or inherited privilege. But wealth and outward success have a way of masking whatever tensions might be quietly building beneath the surface of a marriage. And by early 2019, cracks had begun forming inside the McDonald household. According to accounts that would later emerge, the couple had been navigating disagreements connected to their business. Disagreements about money, about roles, about control. On February 16, 2019, Andreen hosted a birthday celebration for her husband inside their home, a seemingly ordinary, even loving gesture, marking his 40th year. No one at that celebration could have possibly imagined that within 12 days, that same home would become the scene of Andreen's violent death. Family photographs and video footage from that party, later reviewed extensively by investigators and shown to jurors, captured a household that, on that particular night at least, appeared entirely warm and unremarkable. Laughter, cake, a room full of friends and family celebrating together. a jarring contrast to what would unfold behind those same walls less than 2 weeks later. Andréane MacDonald was, by every account gathered from the people who knew her, a woman of extraordinary discipline. She maintained a strict workout regimen that had, over time, made her remarkably strong, capable of powerlifting weights that would challenge even seasoned athletes. Friends and family described her as fiercely independent, deeply committed to her business, and utterly devoted to her young daughter. That same physical strength, so central to who she was as a person, would later become one of the most bizarre and closely scrutinized elements of the entire criminal case that followed her death, transformed by her husband's defense team into the central justification for exactly what had happened to her. As February gave way to March in 2019, the MacDonald household appeared, to the outside world at least, entirely unremarkable. A successful business, a healthy family, a beautiful home. But inside those walls, tensions surrounding the business Andréane had built were quietly reaching a breaking point. Tensions that, within days, would erupt into a confrontation from which only one person would walk away. On February 28th, the couple had an appointment scheduled with their tax preparer, a routine, unremarkable errand for any small business owner. But according to what would later emerge in court, something André saw during that appointment would set in motion the final, catastrophic chain of events, transforming an otherwise ordinary Thursday into the last day of Andréane MacDonald's life. Though almost no one outside that tax office had any idea in the moment just how much was about to change. On February 28, 2019, André and Andréane MacDonald sat inside their tax preparer's office reviewing paperwork for their business, and according to what André would later testify in court, something in those documents stopped him cold. He claimed to have discovered that Andréane had quietly started an entirely separate company roughly a year earlier, without ever telling him. To André, this discovery felt like a profound betrayal. He later described the moment on the witness stand using language that revealed the depth of his anger, that he felt, in his words, robbed. The couple left that appointment and, according to André's own account, tensions between them only continued escalating throughout the remainder of that day. Whether that business dispute truly explains everything that followed, or whether it simply became the convenient framing device around which André later built his entire courtroom narrative, is a question that would eventually consume years of investigation and legal argument. By that evening, back at their home, the argument that had begun in a tax office had grown into something far more volatile. André would later claim that he left the house at one point simply to cool off, driving to a nearby gas station to give himself space before returning home. When he came back, he said he found Andréane waiting for him, and the argument reignited almost immediately, according to his own testimony. This time the fight turned physical. He described Andréane becoming enraged, first with verbal insults, then he claimed physical aggression directed at him, and that he responded in kind before their young daughter walked into the room and interrupted the confrontation. What André told police, and later what he testified to in court, was that he left the room to put his daughter back to bed, and that when he returned roughly half an hour later, he found his wife already dead. He would go on to insist, both to his own defense attorney and eventually to a jury, that whatever had happened inside that house had been an act of self-defense, a claim that, on its surface, seemed to explain the tragedy while conveniently avoiding any admission of intentional violence. The following morning, March 1st, when Andréane failed to appear at work or the gym, her absence triggered immediate alarm among co-workers who knew her habits intimately. When investigators eventually made their way to the MacDonald home to begin piecing together what had happened, what they found only deepened the mystery. Andréane's purse remained untouched inside the house. Her keys sat exactly where she always left them on the kitchen counter, and both of the family's vehicles were still parked outside, exactly where they belonged. For a woman known for her rigid discipline and predictable routines, this simply did not add up. Wherever Andréane had gone, she had not driven there, and she had not taken with her any of the ordinary items a person leaving voluntarily would naturally bring along. Lead investigator Frank Stubbs would later describe this exact detail as one of the very first things that told him this was not a simple missing persons case. A woman does not walk away from her own life, her own business, and her own young daughter, while leaving behind every single item she would need to survive even a single ordinary day. As investigators began combing through the house more carefully, small, unsettling details began emerging. One that would prove particularly significant was a trace of blood discovered on a bathroom light switch. A small, easily overlooked detail under ordinary circumstances, but combined with everything else, it took on far greater significance. Investigators also noticed something strange out in the property's expansive backyard. A burn pile, charred and clearly recent, sitting in a spot that had no obvious, innocent explanation. Together, these small pieces of physical evidence began forming the outline of a much darker picture than a simple, unexplained disappearance. Andre MacDonald, for his part, maintained throughout those earliest days of the investigation that he had no idea what had happened to his wife. He continued military service, while civilian investigators quietly built their case around him. But it would not be small talk or casual suspicion that finally gave police the legal foothold they needed to make an arrest. It would be a single, seemingly mundane piece of evidence recovered from an ordinary household trash can. Investigators searching through the MacDonald household's garbage during their initial sweep of the property found something that would ultimately become one of the most damning pieces of evidence in the entire case. A torn-up receipt pieced back together by detectives, revealing a shopping trip Andre had made to a local hardware store in the days immediately following his wife's disappearance. The items on that receipt were, on their own, unremarkable, but together, in the specific context of a missing wife and an already suspicious husband, they painted an alarming picture: an axe, tarps, and several other items that seemed to have little to no legitimate purpose given the circumstances Andre claimed to be facing. The very fact that he had bothered to tear the receipt into pieces and discard it in the trash rather than simply throwing it away intact struck investigators as its own quiet, telling sign of consciousness of guilt. Lead investigator Frank Stubbs would later describe his reaction to that receipt in blunt, unmistakable terms. It did not, he said, appear that Andre MacDonald had walked into that store planning to do yard work, particularly not with his own wife still missing. In Stubbs' own words, it appeared instead that these items were intended for something far more sinister, a chilling, methodical purpose. Investigators were only just beginning to piece together the kind of purpose that transforms a missing persons case into something investigators approach with an entirely different, far more urgent sense of dread. That receipt gave investigators enough probable cause to move, though not yet for the charge many suspected was ultimately warranted. Andre MacDonald was arrested, not for murder, but for tampering with evidence, connected directly to that torn-up piece of paper recovered from his own trash in April of 2019. He posted bond and was released back into the community, even as the search for his missing wife continued without any resolution. For Andrean's family, watching a suspect walk free on a lesser charge while the woman they loved remained missing was its own particular agonizing form of torment. Meanwhile, hundreds of volunteers working alongside law enforcement and Andrean's own devastated family continued combing through fields, wooded areas, and rural properties across Bexar County. Week after week, month after month, the search stretched on without any breakthrough. For Andrean's mother, her young daughter, and everyone who loved her, each passing day without answers deepened an already unbearable uncertainty. Was she still alive somewhere, being held against her will? Or was this search at its core already a search for a body rather than a living, breathing woman? Volunteers organized search parties on weekends, distributed flyers throughout the community, and kept Andrean's story alive in local media, refusing to let public attention fade even as the weeks stretched into months without any sign of her. That sustained public pressure would ultimately prove essential in keeping the investigation active and visible during a period when the case could easily have quietly slipped from the headlines. That agonizing uncertainty finally ended in July of 2019, 133 days after Andre MacDonald first vanished, when a local farmer, working his land roughly 6 miles from the MacDonald family home, came across something he would never forget. He later described the moment to investigators with simple, haunting clarity that he had seen what appeared to be a human skull lying in an open field. That single, horrifying discovery ended months of searching and confirmed the fear that had quietly settled over Andrean's family and friends almost from the very beginning. Less than 48 hours after that farmer's grim discovery, Andre McDonald was arrested once again, this time for murder. He pleaded not guilty to the charge, and for years afterward, he remained almost entirely silent about what had actually happened inside that house, offering no detailed account, no confession, nothing beyond his original claim of ignorance. That silence would ultimately stretch on for nearly 4 years until, on the 6th day of his own murder trial, Andre McDonald finally took the witness stand himself, and for 4.5 uninterrupted hours delivered an account of that night so detailed and so disturbing that it would leave the entire courtroom and eventually a national television audience in stunned, horrified silence. When Andre McDonald finally took the witness stand in January of 2023, nearly 4 years after Andrean's death, he offered jurors an account of that final confrontation that was almost impossible to reconcile with the polished, disciplined military officer sitting before them. He testified that after their argument at the tax office escalated into a full-blown confrontation at home, Andreen had charged into a room, gotten directly in his face, and spit on him. At that moment, he claimed, some kind of physical clash occurred between them, describing what he called a clash of heads that opened up a cut somewhere on her face. From there, his account of the violence that followed only grew more graphic and disturbing.
I told him, but since she's, she's bigger than I am, she's pretty strong, so trying to hold her, to restrain her or some shit like that, that's probably not feasible. So I just gave her a few kicks, maybe like a couple of kicks, to like knock the wind out of her and get her to stop. So at that point, I sort of like, go over her and she's not moving. And then I bend over to like check, see.
Check?
Yes.
Tell me how.
So I bend over and then I like grab their face and then like feel like if I can feel like a pulse or something, and then I put my ear next to like her nose to see if she was breathing, and she was not.
What kind of reaction did that make you have?
So at that point, honestly, man, I became like pretty frantic at that point because, oh fucking shit, she's dead on the floor. We just had a fight. Obviously, I'm gonna get blamed for this, and I got a 7-year-old autistic kid upstairs that who's gonna take care of her. So, I mean, it was a pretty scary situation.
For 4.5 hours, jurors, reporters, and Andrean's own grieving family sat listening as Andre walked through, in painstaking and often clinical detail, exactly what he claimed had happened and exactly what he had done in the hours and days that followed. A level of graphic detail so unusual for a self-defense claim that even seasoned courtroom observers described it as one of the more unsettling pieces of testimony they had ever witnessed. Central to Andre's entire defense strategy was an argument almost unheard of in a domestic violence case, that he had acted in self-defense against a wife who was, in his own words, extremely powerful. His defense team went so far as to present video evidence during the trial showing Andreen powerlifting, and even carrying her husband on her back during a workout, all in an effort to convince jurors that despite his own greater height and military training, he had genuinely feared for his life during their physical altercation. Prosecutors and many observers following the case found this framing deeply troubling, using a victim's own strength and discipline as a tool to help justify the violence that ultimately killed her. Domestic violence advocates who later commented publicly on the case pointed out how rare and troubling it was to see a defendant's legal strategy hinge so directly on portraying his own wife's fitness and physical discipline, the very qualities that had made her such a successful, admired businesswoman, as evidence somehow supporting his claim of victimhood inside their own home. But perhaps the most shocking testimony came not from the moments of the killing itself, but from what Andre described doing afterward. He told jurors, in graphic and unflinching detail, how he had disposed of his wife's body. According to his own account, he transported her remains, burned them, and, in one particularly disturbing detail highlighted by the trial judge, beat her remains with a claw hammer in an apparent attempt to obscure or destroy identifying evidence, He even described mixing cow bones in among her remains, seemingly hoping to further confuse anyone who might eventually discover them. Courtroom observers noted that throughout this portion of his testimony, Andre's demeanor remained almost eerily calm and composed, a detail that would later draw sharp, pointed criticism from the very judge presiding over his sentencing, who compared his apparent lack of visible emotion to the kind of cold detachment more commonly associated with predatory, premeditated violence, rather than a genuine act of desperate self-defense. The medical examiner's own testimony added another layer of complexity and doubt to Andre's account. Given the severely degraded condition of Andrean's remains after months of exposure and Andre's own attempts at destruction, investigators were never able to conclusively determine the precise cause of death through forensic examination alone, meaning the entire case ultimately hinged not on a clear physical cause of death, but on Andre's own testimony, and whether jurors found his self-defense narrative credible in light of everything else investigators had uncovered. After a lengthy, emotionally exhausting trial, the jury began deliberations, and what followed was an unusually difficult and drawn-out process. Jurors deliberated for more than 10 hours without reaching a unanimous verdict, at one point growing so deadlocked that the presiding judge, Frank Castro, issued what is known as an Allen charge, instructing them to continue deliberating rather than risk an outright mistrial. In total, jurors spent nearly 13 hours wrestling with the case before finally reaching their decision. And when that verdict was announced, it stunned many people who had followed the case closely.
And Mr. McDonald, please stand with your counsel. To the count of murder charged in the indictment, the jury finds the defendant not guilty of the offense of murder, as charged in the indictment, and guilty of the offense of manslaughter.
Andre McDonald was found not guilty of murder, but guilty of the lesser charge, manslaughter.
Not guilty of murder, but guilty of the lesser charge of manslaughter. Two jurors later told 48 Hours that despite that verdict, not a single person in that jury room actually believed Andre McDonald's claim of self-defense. They simply could not unanimously agree that prosecutors had proven murder beyond a reasonable doubt. Because Andre McDonald had elected, at the very start of his trial, to let Judge Frank Castro, rather than the jury, determine his ultimate punishment, sentencing fell entirely to the judge, and Castro did not hold back. Before announcing his decision, he directly addressed McDonald, acknowledging his previously clean criminal record and genuinely impressive military career, but stating plainly that none of it, could ever justify the death of his wife. Castro then delivered a rebuke that would later be widely quoted across national news coverage, telling McDonald that the way he had burned his wife's body, beaten it with a hammer, and desecrated her remains reflected something closer to the cold, detached emotion of a serial killer than a man who had simply, tragically, defended himself. That comparison, delivered directly from the bench in open court, captured precisely the disconnect so many observers following the case had struggled to reconcile between McDonald's calm, methodical account of covering up his wife's death and his repeated insistence that everything leading up to that moment had simply been a desperate act of self-preservation. Castro handed down the maximum possible sentence available under the manslaughter conviction, 20 years in prison. Prosecutors had specifically emphasized McDonald's continued lack of remorse and his extensive efforts to cover up the crime while arguing forcefully for that maximum sentence. McDonald's own defense team, in turn, pointed to his previously spotless record and even highlighted a trust fund he had established for his young autistic daughter as evidence of his character. But the judge remained unmoved. Given time already served, McDonald would ultimately become eligible for parole in approximately 7.5 years, a number that struck many following the case as painfully insufficient, given everything jurors and the public had heard throughout the trial. The most gutting moment of that entire sentencing hearing came not from lawyers or the judge, but from Andre and Andrean's own daughter, only 7 years old at the time of her mother's killing, unable to attend or speak in person. She had written a letter that a victim advocate read aloud to the courtroom on her behalf, in words almost too painful to comprehend, coming from a child that young. She told her father directly that he had killed her mother, taken away her life, broken her heart, and hurt her feelings, and that he would pay for what he had done and be punished forever. There was hardly a dry eye left in that courtroom. By the time those words had finished being read aloud, family members later described that letter as the single moment that finally seemed to crack through Andre's otherwise composed, largely unreadable demeanor throughout the proceedings, though even then, observers noted, his outward reaction remained remarkably muted given the devastating weight of what his own daughter had just written to him. McDonald later pleaded guilty to a separate charge of tampering with evidence, connected to that original torn-up hardware store receipt investigators had recovered years earlier, resulting in an additional 5-year sentence to be served consecutively on top of his manslaughter conviction, bringing his combined total time behind bars to 25 years. He has since filed an appeal challenging both convictions, an appeal that was ultimately denied in August of 2024, closing off, at least for now, his most direct avenue for overturning the verdict. Beyond the criminal case, Andrine's family pursued a separate civil lawsuit against Andre for her wrongful death, and in March of 2024, a San Antonio civil jury delivered a staggering verdict, awarding Andrine's mother and young daughter $210 million, understood to be the largest personal injury verdict in the history of Bexar County. While no amount of money could ever undo what had happened inside that San Antonio home, the verdict stood as a powerful, unmistakable public statement. One entire jury, hearing an entirely different presentation of the same underlying facts, had reached a very different conclusion about what Andre McDonald had truly done to his wife. In the end, Andrine McDonald is remembered not simply as a headline or a self-defense argument built around her own strength and discipline, but as a driven, hard-working immigrant who built something extraordinary from nothing, and as a mother whose daughter will carry both the loss and her memory for the rest of her life.